how we, why the assignment week of this week is set up that the way it is. There's a specific sort of method to it, let's call it. And there's a reason why I make you guys do all these assignments, is to help you better inform how you can make complex shapes starting with simple form, right? So we're going to go over a couple of topics. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask him in chat. So the first thing that I wanted to discuss is when we look at the human mannequinization, so the figure mannequinization, we see two basic forms actually. So, and I hope you see this well enough. So what we're seeing is sort of a box for the head, a cylinder for the neck, another box that contains the rib cage, a cylinder for the abdomen, a box that contains the pelvic area, a cylinder for the upper leg, a cylinder for the lower leg, a box for the feet, cylinder for the arms, and maybe a box for the hands. Right? So interestingly enough, what we see here is that if we look at the setup, we basically have a box, a cylinder for the neck, another box for the rib cage, a cylinder for the abdomen, another box for the pelvic area, and then multiple cylinders for the limbs and the legs, or the arms and the legs, right? Now, when we look at how many artists have mannequinized creatures, is that we basically see the same thing happening. So the example that I gave you guys, for instance, in the video this week, if we look at a goat, but basically if we look at any quadruped animal, is that we can have a box for the head, a cylinder for the neck, a box that contains more of the shoulder girdle and some of the ribcage area, a cylinder for the abdomen, another box for the pelvic area, and then a smaller cylinder for the upper leg, and then different from human anatomy is that we have another small cylinder for the lower leg, and then we have another cylinder for the feet, basically, because this is the heel going into the feet. Same on the other side. And then we have a cylinder tail, and ears. Right? So as you can see, what the similarities are is that we have same box for the head, a cylinder for the neck, a box containing the shoulder girdle, a cylinder for the tummy or the abdomen, another box for the pelvic area, and then cylindrical volumes for the limbs, right? And it's basically, especially with quadrupeds, and that involves, cats, big cats, hoofed animals, other things like crocodiles or stuff like that, reptiles. It's only a matter of changing the proportions, or we only need to study the proportions of a certain animal, but we can use the same mannequinization to get a different result, right? So if, for instance, we make a smaller pelvic area, a substantially larger abdomen area, and an even larger, shoulder girdle area, and then a super long neck, you can already guess what kind of animal that we're creating, right? But the setup is almost exactly the same, right? A very short upper leg, quite a longer lower leg, right? So as you can see, just by changing the proportions, we can create different animals. And that's basically what I want you to take away from this mannequinization, is that this type of mannequinization is pretty useful because we have the same setup as human anatomy, but we can translate that to animal, not anatomy, but animal proportions, and just play around with the simple boxes and cylinders to create a wide variety of animals, right? Now, also something that is interesting to note, especially when you want to create animals that move and stuff like that, is that usually, and we see this in all types of animals, is that the box-like forms stay rigid. So I'm going to put an R here. The cylindrical forms are flexible, right? So we have rigid and flexible forms. So we have rigid forms for the boxes, flexible ones for the cylinders. And this is kind of true for everything. And if you think about it, like, there's no way that we can manipulate the head or the shoulder girdle or our pelvic area, but the things like the tummy and the neck are very flexible, right? So if we, for instance, look at like a deer, we have a pretty rigid shoulder girdle, and then we can have a very flexible abdomen area, and then again we can go rigid for the pelvic area, And then we can add in the cylinders for the legs. We can have a flexible neck. Right? So you get the idea is that you have flexible forms, which are the cylindrical areas, and the legs, of course, right? And we have the rigid forms, which is basically the head, the shoulder girdle, and the pelvic area. Right, so is that making sense so far? The similarities in the mannequinization? And now we can use sort of the division of the mannequin, the figure mannequin, into the animal mannequin. Does that make sense? All right, goody. So now what we can do, and this is primarily why I have you guys study anatomy, is the thing with animal anatomy that you probably need to figure out on your own is that the anatomy of animals and humans is basically the same. Again, just like the mannequinization, it's differently proportioned, but almost all the same bones and muscles are present, right? Whether that's the scapula or the pelvic bone or sternocleidomastoid muscle in the neck or deltoid muscles, triceps, it's almost all present. The thing is, it's just differently proportioned. Now, it's easier to learn these proportions with the mannequinization that I just showed you, and then learn to have the anatomy that you studied from a particular animal, let's say a deer or a goat, and have that inform your simple shapes, right? So what I mean by that is that if we look at, for instance, the back of a deer, right? So let's say we have the pelvic area of a deer. I'm gonna draw that a little larger, right? In the mannequinization, you would first start with a simple box for the pelvic area, right? And then we would have a shorter cylinder for the upper leg, right? Of course, this is pretty crude, right? It's still very boxy, very cylindrical, very rigid, and as artists, we want to make things look believable. The thing is, however, that always learning anatomy from every angle, you could do it, of course, but it is very time-consuming before you understand where every muscle insertion goes, where every bone goes or protrudes outside of the silhouette of the animal. And it's very hard to do that for all animals, right? So if we have like this simple template of a mannequinization, and we can then have somewhat of a generalized idea of what the majority of the anatomy looks like, we can use that to inform more complex shapes, right? So what we know when we look at, and here's the tail, by the way, for the deer, like this. What we know for a fact is that there is a tailbone somewhere in here, and we have that pelvic area, that goes down and connects somewhere down here, and then connects with the humerus up here. And it does the same on the other side. Right? And then we have the spine going forward. Now, of course, this is all very confusing. And the only thing that we concern ourselves with as artists is usually the surface area of any subject that we're drawing. Unless you're like a creature designer like Terrell Whitlatch, where you really need to know the anatomy because you're creating creatures that need to be super believable. As artists, we just want to have a general idea. Even when we're concepting or we're doing illustration, we just want to make things look believable. So in my opinion, it's better to create complex forms that look very believable, right? So instead of thinking about this complex anatomy, we can use that anatomy to better inform our simple shape, the one that I have here in blue. So instead of having it like a crude box, we could, in the first step of your development, say like, okay, we have the spine, which is probably, and this is why I let you do the shape manipulation, right? It's probably going to bend up that box quite a bit. And the abdomen is actually funneling or pinching inwards, to the rear of the animal, right? So it's not like a super straight box, the pelvic area. It's more like a triangular box, right? So we can draw that. So we have a form that goes up a bit, and then it pinches inward a little bit like this. Right? So this is already a more complex shape that is informed by the anatomy that we've studied. Right? Same for the legs. It's not just simple straight cylinders. We have muscles in there like the bicep femoris, the glute muscles and stuff like that. But we only need to concern ourselves with the outer silhouette and the superficial form that those muscles are making. So you need to look at reference, of course, when you're doing this, but at a certain point, you will have created complex shapes that will usually inform any type of animal, right? And so this simple cylinder could be turned into a cylinder that looks a little bit more like this. And then we have the quadricep going into the knee, right, like this. Right. And so basically, again, what I'm doing is shape manipulation. I'm pinching the form here, and I'm bending it a little here, that basic cylinder, right? So then this is already looking a little bit more organic. And we could take that a step further, and this is basically what professional artists usually do when they're thinking about this, is that they have they let the anatomy inform those simple shapes, but they connect everything, and they're not drawing everything separately as if it were like an actual mannequin, right? So as you can see here, I'm still drawing the top of the cylinder, which in reality wouldn't happen, of course, and I'm still drawing the entire box, which in reality wouldn't happen either. So if we take it a step further, what we could do is we could connect all these forms. Right. Let's just take my notes. So we could have something like this. And then we have the side of the box moving straight into that leg bone. We could have something that looks more organic like this. And what's interesting as well is that these simple forms not only inform us about the structure of the animal, but also about how we can shade it, right? Because if I were to shade this organic form, I can still think about this back plane and the way I would shade a cylinder. So I would still go, cross hatch a little bit here maybe, and then cross hatch down like this, right? Giving some extra dimension to my organic form. And then we could Oh, that's because I just wanted to show you that this is an extra part of the leg, right? We could add more volume to this, and make it as organic as we did with the rest of the form, but this was just to illustrate that this is a leg, right? We can connect all those lines if we want to. Right, so let's look at another example. For instance, if we look at the neck of like a large deer, for instance, right? So when we start, or when you start with the mannequinization, you start with a very simple cylinder for the neck, right? Now, of course, this isn't an actual representation of the anatomy or the structure of a deer. So what we need to do, and we can do that in a couple of steps, is look at the deer first and foremost. We always need reference in the beginning when we're studying. And we can see that the cylinder is smaller near the head because it needs to fit into the skull, right? And it's larger towards the shoulder girdle because it needs to connect with the spine and the muscles of the chest, right? So if we look at the underlying anatomy, again, we have the skull of a deer sitting somewhere in here, right, like this. We have the spine going along that line, and then we have some neck muscles as well, connecting to the front, and some other neck muscles as well. So we can again have those muscles and the bone structure inform that simple shape. So before we do that, we can first maybe, again, manipulate that form by pinching it or stretching it at some points, like making it a little bit smaller near the top, and then a little bit wider near the bottom. Right, so that would already be a better visual representation. but it wouldn't be super accurate yet, because what we need to do is we need to also include those contour lines that indicate the spine and the protrusion of that thick neck muscle, and then maybe that sort of extra small patch of fur that they have at the bottom of their neck, right? So what we can then again do is use shape manipulation to better inform this simple cylinder. So what I'm going to do now is going to pinch at the top, maybe pinch a little at the bottom. So if let's just look at this contour for a second. So this is what the cross section of that cylinder is looking right now. And what I'm going to do, again, to inform my anatomy, I'm not doing this randomly, I'm not inventing this, it's just that I know that the anatomy looks like this somewhat. It's not 100% accurate, it doesn't need to be. I know that the spine is going to be somewhere over here, and we're going to have neck muscles somewhere over here, and then that patch of fur here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch that cross section here and here, which gives me a form that looks more like this, right? So this is a little exaggerated, but it's just to get the point across, right? And so this gives me a much more complex organic form, but it is informed by simple shapes plus my knowledge of anatomy. And so that's why I make you guys do these assignments this week. It's start with simple mannequinization of your animal. Really get that ingrained so you're a little bit more free with perspective drawing and just drawing simple shapes in perspective and different angles, and then learn the anatomy to have that anatomy inform your simple shapes to make more complex shapes. Now, making more complex shapes isn't easy. It does require a lot of practice, but once you understand these more complex forms, it will become much easier and more efficient to draw things from imagination, right? And that's basically what artists do. If you look at a guy like, Kim Young-ji primarily, is that instead of drawing this, right? So instead of drawing this, what Kim Young-ji does is the exact same thing. He is doing this, just informed with anatomy knowledge, right? So instead, he's doing right? Does that make sense? So he's just using the exact same setup, but he's just informed by anatomy. He's able to make much more complex shapes in perspective, right? Okay, question. Why mannequins look good, but after moving from second to the third step, things look off? What could be the problem? Well, the problem, Nico, is usually a lack of knowledge on your part, whether it's about the anatomy or the structure of the animal. And it's also, it very much has to do with just nice aesthetics when it comes to line drawing. The thing is that when you go from step 2 to step 3, this is not believable, right? Step 2 isn't believable. If I make this with, quite complex shapes, this animal, it still wouldn't look believable because it's a mannequin. As soon as we step into these more complex shapes that are connected and are actually showing anatomy and structure and connections, things start to become believable. Now, of course, if you then deviate somewhat of your perspective, or some of the anatomy is incorrect, or some of the proportions are incorrect, that believability just, becomes zero, basically. Or it will just look off, right? And that's usually the case. I think the best way, Gabriel, is to always do step 1 or step 2 with correct proportions as best as you can, in perspective, in all different kind of angles that you can, and do like maybe 3 of these step 2 mannequins, and then try to do one in step 3, right, in the exact same angle, because then you've you've trained your hand-eye coordination with these simple volumes in good perspective, with good proportion of the animal that you actually want to represent, and then you can have a go at the ultimate complex shape or representation of that animal. All right, so did I have anything else? Okay, can I do that here? Yeah. All right, so another thing that I wanted to mention is that if you look at, for instance, one of my favorite artists, Claire Wendling, I'm not sure if you know her, but Claire Wendling is an amazing sketch artist, and everyone compliments her on her anatomy knowledge. And I'm not here to diminish that, but I'm pretty sure that she has a very good mannequinization structure in her mind when she's drawing or sketching these animals, because she's ridiculously good at sketching animals, and she can sketch them in any angle. And she's Claire Wendling. I'll send a link later. But the thing is that not only does she represent animals in a very cool manner, she can also stylize them ridiculously well. And that's why I think that she has more of a mannequinization in her mind than actual anatomy, is because the cool thing about drawing with a mannequin, like I show you here, is that once we've established shapes for this animal, we can start playing with those shapes, right? We can start stylizing those shapes. We can start to manipulate those shapes. And if you look at like a sketch from Claire Wendling, for instance, you see that she has like this beautiful representation of like, this is like the back of it's like a combination of a human and a deer. I'm not sure what that's called, but in my mind, she has the exact same process going on. It's just with very appealing lines, right? And instead of actually representing the correct proportions, she's choosing to really over stylize, you know, the feet portion of the animal. Right, like this. So she uses beautifully fluent lines to come up with something that looks really believable, but yet a lot more interesting than if we were to use maybe a bit more realistic proportions. Right. So when you see a sketch like this, you're like, wow, beautiful. And you know, a lot of you probably always wonder, like, why does it work so well and stuff like that? And the reason is that, of course, Claire has amazing anatomical knowledge, right? But I'm pretty sure she's also always thinking about the mannequinization of her sketches. And I think when I look at, as a professional, when I look at her sketches, this sort of shines through as well, because she's really using lines that kind of reveal her thought process, and her forms may be a little bit more, let's say, organic, but they still reveal that sort of mannequinized structural thinking that I showed you, you know, earlier on. Okay. Okay. And I think the cool thing here as well is that if any of you are like maybe interested in creating more cartoony characters, like a Disney character or a Pixar character, these shapes come in handy ridiculously well. I'm sure if, you know, people that are new here, be sure to check out the shape language video that I have up in the classrooms. But you know, everyone else that's been here, I know you know that I've talked about shape language quite a lot. And if, for instance, we want to create like a Disney character and we want to make like a friendly, cutesy type of goat, you know, we probably go with like circular shapes and exaggerated proportions, right? And so we can manipulate the shapes of this goat, right, to come up with more of those cutesy like features. All we need to do is just play with the proportions a little bit. Right? So this is very crude, very simple, but this is basically the gist of it. Now, I'm not saying that animators or character designers always think in this structural manner, because they probably don't. They use a lot of, you know, S curves and C curves and gesture to come up with the idea. But when we want to solidify our designs, the structure is definitely a key element in order to make things believable. And so I don't think it's a bad idea to start to learn creating characters with this mannequinization. because it will help you a lot with understanding anatomy better, understanding structure better, especially understanding perspective better, and just getting more efficient with your drawing and your painting and everything else. And I think that's all I wanted to say about the matter. How do you think she retains and applies texture so believable in so many different animals? I think it's just mileage, Gabriel, and also the texture is usually more of a suggestion of believability, or you know, an indication more than the actual representation of those textures. It's just that she's so experienced in shading and texturing a certain, you know, amount of artists, animals that she's very familiar with, that she makes it look believable every time. But that just comes down to mileage, and also just thinking about these shapes, right? Because if we shade an animal as if it were a mannequin, so using the volumetrics of that animal and shading it accordingly, right? Like if we were to shade a cylinder, then that volume would already become a lot more believable. And if we do that consistently throughout the animal, using the more organic shapes that I've showed you here, we can create something that looks really believable. Of course, you should always try and learn some of the more advanced things like gesture, like lighting, like shading, like design, because you know you need to do this consistently throughout your career or your artistic journey, and you need to learn from your mistakes, right? So you need to suck at gesture and then do more structure, and suck at some more at gesture, and then see what you did wrong or where you could, you know, be better, and then do it consistently until some of your gesture becomes, you know, not painful to look at. Can you overlay gesture lines on the giraffe? It's the same thing. This usually gesture is more for like dynamic poses, but you know the gesture of this giraffe would just be, you know, and then a straight versus a C curve for the abdomen, and then we could use like maybe like an S curve with a straight, and you know, another S curve with a straight, same here, S curve with like a straight and maybe a C curve, right? So, but that gesture is all informed by structure. All right. Cool. Well, that's it for me, guys. This classroom session has been recorded.